Sair da escola já com uma formação profissional no currículo? Parece bom demais pra ser verdade, né? Pois é. No ensino técnico do Senac, isso é possível. É ensino médio junto com formação técnica, que acontece durante os 3 anos. Lá, eles usam metodologia para projetos, desenvolvendo competências como resolução de problemas, pensamento crítico e colaboração, além de valores éticos e sustentáveis. Quer saber? Senac. Acesse sp.senac.br/ensino médio e saiba mais.
Hey everyone, it's Dawnie. The following is a free teaser of our latest member bonus episode. If you like what you're hearing and would like to listen to the whole thing, become an Ursa member today in Apple Podcasts or by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll help support our show and you'll get access to our entire archive of member exclusives. That's ursastory.com/join. Thanks for listening.
We get the narrator's sort of derision and the disdain for jazz and the village and the people who play jazz. He doesn't even know who Charlie Parker is.
I know.
Like, oh.
He's like, who's this Parker
Bird?
fellow
Who's
you
this
speak
bird?
of?
Yeah.
Hi, Deesha.
Hey, Dawnie.
And welcome, everyone, to Ursa Short Fiction, where we geek out on our favorite short stories and writers. I'm Dawnie Walton, author of the final revival of Opal and Nev.
And I'm Deesha Philyaw, author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
And as always, this show is supported by you. Become an Ursa member today by going to Apple Podcasts or ursastory.com/join. You'll get exclusive episodes and you'll help us keep making this show. So as y'all know, we like to shake things up around here. Every season, we've got some new approaches to how we do things. And today, we're kicking off a mini-series that we like to call Iconic Stories. It's kind of like a book club, but rather than talking about an entire collection or novel, we're going to go deep on a single story. And this can be a classic story from the archives or perhaps even a modern story from a writer who has changed the game for everyone. So, Deesha, what are we going to break down today?
I can think of no better way to kick off this series, Dawnie, than with Sonny's Blues, the 1957 short story written by James Baldwin, originally published in Partisan Review. Baldwin republished the work in the 1965 short story collection, Going to Meet the Man. Now, for listeners, there's no mandatory homework on Ursa short fiction, but you can always follow along by reading the story. There's a link in the show notes. Before we talk about the story, let's talk about James Baldwin, the writer. So James Baldwin is the writer that made me want to be a writer. He's that writer that you see what he does on the page. And I wasn't a teenager yet. I was reading Louise Merriweather's Daddy Was a Number Runner. Starting from the time I was 10, I probably read it all through my teen years and into college. It still is my favorite book. The foreword. So I had never read a novel that had a foreword to it. And as a kid, I didn't know, what is this? And who's this guy, James Baldwin? But he was giving context, historical and cultural and social and political context to this novel. And so much of what he wrote about this novel and about Black girlhood and what Louise Merriweather was doing with this groundbreaking work went right over my head as a kid. But I made a note that this guy, James Baldwin, who is he? And so then went to the library, remember card catalogs? And I went to the card catalog. And I think the first book by Baldwin that I read was Go Tell It on the Mountain. How about you?
So I didn't actually read any James Baldwin until, freshman year of college. At FAMU, I took an African American literature course, and we read If Beale Street Could Talk. And so I always, from the beginning, knew Baldwin for his fiction, because after I read that book, then I started to read other pieces of his fiction. And it wasn't until later when Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me came out, and, reading about the fire next time, that I understood that most people kind of talked about his nonfiction work, but I have always loved his fiction. And Sonny's Blues is the story, one of the stories that, and I think like there's a Joyce Carol Oates story, I forget the name of it, but it's like involves the devil and a teenage girl. But those two stories, I think, are maybe like two of the most anthologized short stories that have like ever been. And when I started learning more about short fiction, especially when I was in grad school getting my MFA, like that was a story that everybody knew and everybody talked about. And so I'm excited to talk about some of the reasons why it's so classic and iconic. Go Tell It on the Mountain is maybe craft-wise my favorite novel. That. The things that novel is doing with setting, with point of view, with the weaving of history, like all of those things, I was just like blown away by that novel. So the fact that that was like the first that you read by him, I'm kind of jealous of that.
Oh, it was. And it was like, oh, you know, it was that kind of book where, oh, I must read everything by this person. And then through my teens and into my 20s, I would just reread Toni Morrison and James Baldwin every year, as many books as I could fit in. But I came late to Sonny's Blues. I'm embarrassed to say, and I think partly because I didn't go through an MFA program. And I remember being at Kimbilio in 2015. I think it was when I was there in 2015. And one of the other fellows was saying something, just like a throwaway comment about, you know, James Baldwin's classics, short story Sonny's Blues. And I was like, how was that never on my radar? And so quietly I read it because I felt like, how in my big age have I not read this story? And it's simply breathtaking. There's certain lines, and just James Baldwin and Harlem were synonymous for me.
Yes.
And so I went to Harlem for the first time in 1989. And Harlem was a very different place than when he was writing. And so I was very much not prepared for what I saw, because even though he doesn't romanticize Harlem in his books, I had romanticized it as an extension of my feelings for him as a writer. And I also, you know, this is pre-internet. And so I had this wild idea that when I went to Harlem that year, I was staying with a friend for Thanksgiving, freshman year of college, that somehow I would run into him on the streets. And I found out and was devastated to know he had died 2 years earlier, you know, and so there was no internet, and I was not reading the New York Times regularly. So I didn't know he had died, and I wasn't running, you know, in these literary circles. And so he shaped literature for me. He shaped Harlem in my imagination, in this idea of place and Harlem. And there have been so many Harlems, but James Baldwin's Harlem is the one that I was clinging to.
I want to, just bouncing off what you were saying about his writing and his stories being synonymous with Harlem, I also kind of feel that way about religion in his work. Constantly popping up, of course. Go Tell It on the Mountain was sort of like his autobiographical novel in a way, because he himself had been like a youth preacher, 14 years old in Harlem. But I was surprised to reread this story. I've read it this is the third time I've maybe read Sonny's Blues. And I remember very vividly the beginning of this story and the end of this story. But there's that whole scene, and we're going to go back in a minute and sort of contextualize all of this. But there's a whole like very visceral scene where the characters are sort of looking at this like religious revival kind of happening in the street. And his descriptions about like the passion of religion and the catharsis of religion in his work is something that like is always fascinating to read. And I wonder also if, you know, I mean, you have a book sort of rotating around religion and religious belief and skepticism of religion and those kinds of things. And I wonder if that was influential for you as well, reading Baldwin.
I think in an osmosis kind of way, because the experiences of religious ecstasy and Go Tell It on the Mountain and some other works really did make an imprint on me. And I definitely know that I don't write about the church because of my, you know, fondness for, or that the church has a particular place in my heart. It was just more culturally. And then seeing James Baldwin, explore it on the page in literature and doing it in a way that was like, oh, I've seen that before. It felt so familiar and it felt so much at home. And I wasn't seeing that in anybody else's literature. But I can't say that there's a direct through line that I was very conscious of. But it has to be, and there must be some impact, because I can't stop writing about the church. Even though I don't go to church anymore and haven't for over 15 years, it was sort of an imprinting. I think you might be right. Not only my experiences in church, but reading James Baldwin and his engagement with the church and that ecstasy of it. And not just because he was writing about church, but just the emotionality of it. It just lingers and lingers and lingers.
Mm-hmm. And so let's back up a little bit and talk a little generally what Sonny's Blues is about. So we have an unnamed first-person narrator. He's a Black algebra teacher living in Harlem again. And he, in this story, is recounting the tale of his younger brother Sonny's drug addiction. The story opens with him reading about Sonny's arrest in the newspaper and not believing it. And there's sort of this iconic image of him feeling like there's an ice block in his belly and it slowly melts throughout the day, but it never goes away. And we get glimpses of backstory of their relationship through the years. And then we also see Sonny coming home from this incarceration and the brothers sort of getting to know each other again. And Sonny dreams of being a jazz musician, and his brother is a little respectability. And so is very much like, how are you going to make any money? Like, what is it, what are you throwing your life away? He's very worried for his brother. The narrator also, we should mention, is mourning the death of his 2-year-old daughter from polio. And so there's a lot going on in this story. We get both present story and past story. We get details about their parents and some traumas that their father went through, witnessing his own brother being murdered. And we see sort of the mother's faith. And we feel the responsibility, I think, that the narrator feels toward his brother and his helplessness in helping his brother. And one of the things that I love about reading this story, which again was originally published in 1957, and then became more, I think, popular through Going to Meet the Man, is that there are things in it that feel of the time. Of course, the polio being a killer of many children. But also, there are things that reminded me of experiences that I have witnessed. For instance, I remember, and you and I are both from Jacksonville and have ties to the north side of Jacksonville, which at that time was like almost like 100% Black, right? So it was like our own Harlem in Jacksonville. And I remember riding around in the car with my parents, going to see my grandparents. And they would say, one would say to the other, looking out the window and seeing somebody on the street, oh, there's Johnny. Oh, God, he's gone.
He's on that stuff.
He's gone. And that's how they would put it, is he's gone, when someone that they had known from so long ago in high school was like losing their life to addiction, essentially. And I remember that sadness that I felt even as a child and the helplessness that my parents probably felt to do anything about it. And this story just reminded me so much of that. And so in that sense, like, it feels so timeless.
Yes, because we, there was in Jacksonville, we had our heroin era, and I have a family member that was caught up in that, who is, boomer generation. And then for us, we had the crack era, and the euphemism I grew up hearing was, he's on that stuff. And that could refer to heroin, it could refer to crack. But there was just this sort of heavy sense of, hopelessness, which permeates Sonny's Blues. And as you said, unfortunately, that is a timeless kind of feeling. And Baldwin does something else that just really, as if that wasn't heavy enough, we have this, from the very beginning, this foreboding, because this episode has spoilers. So you might want to stop here and go and read the story, where he meets a friend of Sonny's who is dealing with his own addiction. And the friend basically tells us, what he thinks is going to happen. He's going to, get clean inside, and then he's going to come out, and then it's going to get him all over again. And I remember the first time I read Sonny's Blues, I just thought, I can't keep reading this, but what Baldwin did with that is you're immediately rooting for Sonny for that not to be the case.
Yeah.
And so the stakes are right there. We're implicated right off the bat. We are in this with Sonny and with the narrator. And then, that also drove how I felt about the narrator, because as much as I understand how addiction works and that it's not anybody's fault, I kept wanting the narrator to do and say different things because I wanted Sonny to win, But I just thought that was such a brilliant device that Baldwin used at the beginning, which is, oh, this is how the story is going to end. And then you spend the rest of the story hoping that's not the case.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this sneak preview of our latest member bonus episode. To hear the rest of it, become an Ursa member in Apple Podcasts or by going to ursastory.com/join.